What do resilient and sustainable supply chain and procurement functions look like in 2021? How could and should supply chains be driven by a company's purpose? And how can they be shaped by environmental, social, and corporate governance strategies? There may be bigger pressure to be transparent and ethical, but what are the benefits of driving supply chain diversity? These are some of the questions under discussion in this short roundtable session. This is one of a series of 3 virtual roundtables sponsored by Refinitiv, a London Stock Exchange Group business. The key takeaways from the roundtables will be presented in an article in the Procurement and Supply Chain Innovation Special Report, which will be published in the Times on March the 24th. My name is Oliver Pickup, and I'm a London-based technology and business journalist. And I'm delighted to be your host and moderator for these roundtables, which are grouped together under the title Building a Resilient and Sustainable Supply Chain in 2021. I'm very much delighted that 6 of the planet's most influential procurement and supply chain leaders, spanning a number of industries and geographical regions, are here to offer their expert insights. A warm welcome to you all. Thank you for agreeing to participate. Given the colossal change the world has undergone in the last 12 months, where outdated methods and ways of working have been exposed, and collaboration and innovation have been essential for business continuity around the world, this is clearly a critical topic. So I'm going to kick things off by asking, what do resilient and sustainable supply chain and procurement functions look like now?
I kind of say, Ollie, it's always been important that a procurement supply function is highly aligned with what it is that your business stands for. I think what you're seeing more and more these days, though, is that companies are thinking much more about their purpose. They're thinking not just about delivering profit to shareholders, but they're also thinking about what are they doing for society. They're thinking about sustainability issues. They're thinking about the issues which are important to society today. And I always say that in a world where consumers think about what brands they're going to buy, where employees think about who they're going to work for, or indeed investors think about who they're going to invest in, based on the reputational image of that company. And that's very much about your supply chain and how you manage your supply chain. Then to me, the really successful procurement supply chain functions of today are those ones that are embracing all of those issues and are highly aligned with the purpose of your organization.
That's great. And I mean, Ingrid, you said that consumer demand has changed significantly. So could you talk to us a bit more about that, please?
How consumer demand changed? Yeah, over the past years during the pandemic, when people were not able to go to restaurants and pubs, they really bought their beer in the stores, right? In the supermarkets, in the liquor stores. So then consumers tend to look for what is more convenient to carry in their cart, in their car, whatever, and that tends to be more cans than anything else. So we saw a shift from what we call draft business and even bottle business, glass bottle business, into aluminum, and that was a huge adjustment for our entire supply chain. And I don't mean just our own lines, right? Because we have our own packaging lines, we have our own vertical operations as well. But even, and that's something I want to touch upon, even in tier 2 and tier 3 level of suppliers, when we talk about building a resilient supply chain for the future, it really is about making sure we have that transparency and visibility all the way to that level 3 supplier, that next time when we hear about a glycol shortage that goes into a coating that is used for a can production, that we feel that we understand who are those suppliers and are able to mitigate risks accordingly.
Is there a sense in recent times that certain vulnerabilities have been exposed, that supposed transparencies have been exposed, and perhaps, Charles, we were speaking the other day and you were saying that due diligence has kind of been rushed through to an extent, and there might be a kind of day of reckoning around the corner.
That's right. I mean, I think it's fair to say that companies acted in the best interest of their stakeholders and their customers. And a lot of times decisions were made and they were truly life and death decisions. And we saw early on in the pandemic, and we continue to see shortages in PPE. And there were a number of companies that were created to help source and deliver PPE very soon after it became clear that there wasn't enough to meet demand. And we saw oftentimes that that companies would onboard suppliers without a thorough amount of due diligence taking place. And they found themselves in situations where the supplier wasn't able to deliver. In a lot of situations, suppliers did deliver, but does that supplier meet to the point earlier, the broader corporate social responsibility that that companies want to live by? And so I think you'll see a lot of going back, revisiting suppliers that were brought on during this time period, doing a thorough analysis, and making the right types of decisions around whether that supplier continues in the supply chain.
And in the news recently that the ESG agenda has been promoted, and perhaps the new Wall Street mantra could be green is good. Investors are interested in this, as well as consumers. So I mean, Thomas, your time is now for the Procurement Pledge. We were talking the other day about how numbers are going through the roof, really. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and what you're hoping to achieve there?
Yeah, I think we see sort of a trend across most, at least advanced organizations, that is driven also by investor sentiment, access to talent, that says you got to up your game and act responsibly, and you've got to look beyond the next quarter. I think that's what we see in many organizations. Of course, that drives a lot of this good spirit towards doing sustainability, also towards the Procurement Pledge. And that's very promising, but the full picture, and I want to go to Ingrid's point here as well, is once you start looking at what really happens in your supply chains in tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, we do see that this sentiment hasn't always reached there just yet. And there was just recently one of the rating agencies, EcoVadis, posted their data based on 65,000 assessments, and there you can see that the sustainable procurement practices in these supply chain organizations is declining over time. So there's a bit of a trend happening. There's a group of companies who get it, who is driving big time the progress, and there's unfortunately a big group of companies that we are missing. And what of course we want to do in the pledge is to make sure we don't lose this community and make sure we operate at the individual level. And if the bosses of those companies doesn't necessarily get it themselves, at least we can offer from a peer-to-peer procurement professional to another the help of the access to the tools. So I agree, it's super promising, but we are far away from where we have to be, and that's the sad reality of the status of affairs.
And you were saying the other day that you're given the interest in what you're providing, you might need to create a not-for-profit. But you're getting inquiries from all over the world, I understand. How far-flung are we talking here?
Well, the very positive reality is that we have people literally from all corners of the world. So from Nepal and Tonga and it's everywhere. And what is important, it's including academia. So we have all the professors engaged. They do see they have a big role in preparing also the next generation. We have the recruitment industry engaged. They also see that they have a big role in making sure that we facilitate the right skill set into future roles. And then we have all degrees of seniority. So many of us were on a call just a week plus ago, and there you really see students sitting with CPOs, with CEOs, and we all sit and talk like at the same level. We talk about a shared challenge, and everybody is prepared to share the knowledge. And of course, that's a phenomena which is maybe driven by the severity of the situation, but it's a super rewarding feeling to also be part of a community where rank and all that is just not relevant. It's about getting things done.
Fantastic. And Ryan, if I could come to you, I mean, as you said, 111 years and the biggest change in the company's history. How does the supply chain procurement look for you?
Well, if you can imagine, the commitment that BP has made to net zero has generated a huge amount of interest with, all of our employees, of course, and it's also opened up doors to access to talent in ways that we probably, wouldn't have had prior to the announcement. I think the biggest thing that we're focused on right now is just making sure people are educated on what we're committing to, right? And I think a lot of us, there's a lot of folks that have been through a lot of change in BP, but none as great as this one. And we're really creating a new identity for the organization. And our CEO, Bernard Looney, has been very, very vocal about how we're going to get to this net zero ambition. But there's milestones we need to achieve. And what that means to, I guess, to procurement and supply chain here in the short run is getting an understanding of how we actually are going to start moving in the direction of net zero through some really pragmatic steps around, understanding our current carbon footprint, for example, understanding the difference between tiers, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, right? And understanding what our commitments are. So there's a lot of education involved, I think. And then, I work with a broad team, both within procurement and, obviously a lot of multidisciplinary teams. And so we're trying to change the culture around how we look at value of our projects as well, right? We need to think differently about how we make decisions and allocate resources, right? So for example, there certainly is a dimension of cost, right, that we need to deliver against. I mean, we're running a large enterprise. However, we're starting to weave in conversations about how do we bring in new sustainable, innovative solutions, right? And supplier diversity and some of the other important metrics to make decisions. And so that's we're very early days in how we do that. And when you're kind of running a category, if I put my category hat on for a minute, there has to be a kind of a set of tools that I can use to actually pull that data, make decisions around risk, cost, and innovation. And we're trying to build that toolkit and that culture around how we make some of those decisions that align with our net zero ambition. So lots of work to do, but very exciting times. And I would just say the energy level around this is it's at a level that I've never experienced. I've been in BP 4 years, and now I'm getting a lot of people, outside of BP, asking me, talking to me about what the journey is looking like and how we're actually going to make this happen. And digital plays a huge role as well. So, we've talked about how we're going to digitize, our journey to a net zero. And so we've, brought in talent from places like Tesla and Google, and the whole profile of the talent base is starting to change a bit. And that is quite exciting and interesting.
Fantastic. And hopefully we can talk about, the value of perhaps changing the framework of metrics a bit later on. But Will, to bring you in, I mean, there's been lots of talk about sustainability, but there's also a really important drive towards greater diversity. So perhaps you can talk a bit about what you've been seeing and how things have developed there and in recent times, and press the case why it's a business imperative to have a more diverse supply chain.
Yeah, and I think just kind of listening to the other panelists and the points that they've made, in total agreement. At GSK, even too, in terms of sustainability, just to touch on that briefly, we also have kind of those long-term goals in place for net zero impact on climate and net positive impact on nature, and we're putting those plans in place because to Malcolm's point, these are things that investors and talent want to see in our companies doing. There's even research survey data that's out there that shows that over 85% of the millennial population, because these are up and coming talent, there are up and coming investors, over 85% of them want to invest in and work for companies that are showcasing their ability to respond to those environmental and social factors that are out there. So when you have programs in place that drive sustainability, programs in place that drive overall diversity and inclusion, programs in place that drive specific factors around supplier diversity, you're showcasing your company to those that up and coming talent and to those investors. But so then on the point, and I think Charles is making as well, you mentioned the PPE. So in terms of having a successful supply chain, we're realizing that we need to be more agile. We need to be able to be more responsive. We have to have the proper contingency plans in place. When you go through a situation like COVID, where literally you could not cross borders with product, right? You couldn't even cross borders with PPE, or you had PPE that was not available to some of the corporations because those bigger companies either had the shortages, or they were kind of held to government requirements, then they had to send it into different directions. Well, at GSK, we were able to use that as an opportunity to kind of showcase the agility and the ability that diverse suppliers could pivot to meet our needs. And we had a great success story come out of that, where we were able to bring in 2 new diverse suppliers into our supply chain, and they met our PPE shortage needs. And we were able to drive, business to them. It gave them opportunity to get exposure to our company, to our stakeholders, to our business, and we were able to leverage them to be able to have the success and kind of keep us going through a hard time over those, matter of months that we had that PPE shortage.
It's a really good point, Will, and I think from the outside looking in, that need for agility and collaboration, perhaps even with competitors, and a kind of mindset shift where perhaps it isn't all driven by profit, seems to have been a big change. Would you agree, Malcolm?
So look, I think it's this whole question of when should you be collaborating with your competitors is something that 25 years ago none of us would ever have talked about, and yet today we recognize there are certain issues out there that none of us can really solve on our own. I mean, look at something like modern day slavery, and look at the issues of modern day slavery in supply chains. And as Ingrid said, it's not just about your first tier, it's your second and your third tier as well. And there is no way that every company can hope on their own to be able to understand exactly what is going on at every stage in their supply chain. Oh, and by the way, if you tie all of your suppliers up responding to audits, rather than thinking about continuous improvement, rather than thinking about improving how they operate, then that's not a great solution either. So combining, collaborating on a, I would say, non-competitive issue like the eradication of modern day slavery in your supply chains, or some of the huge challenges around sustainability and climate change. I think those are absolutely things that lend themselves to a non-competitive and collaborative agenda. And Ollie, the other thing you asked me the other day, what are some of the big factors you think about outside of ESG when you're trying to sort of create a bulletproof supply chain? And I would always say it's about trying to think of the thing that you never think might logically happen to you. The thing that has hit everybody in terms of COVID has been the demand shocks. And they've just been completely unpredictable in almost every single industry that there is. And I think it's going to cause people now to think about, well, what might possibly happen to my supply chain, or happen to my business, or happen to some of the, or what channel shifts might I sort of end up experiencing that I could never previously have thought of. I mean, which logical commercial procurement professional would ever have dreamed up Brexit? And look at the challenges that is bringing today in terms of delays, in terms of additional administration, and you can't believe that this one day or another isn't going to cause some costs. Now, nobody would have thought of that sort of 10, 15 years ago. So what I would challenge is anybody to think out of the box, think about the things that you probably never thought would ever hit you, and then think about how you're going to be able to protect yourself against those.
That's brilliant. And Charles, perhaps considering that there is the need to, or there has been the need to identify new suppliers, some perhaps virtually, and we've talked a lot about how it's important to know the different tiers of the supply chain and, third-party risk. Perhaps you could give some advice to people on how to identify and perform a kind of rushed due diligence, perhaps.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think ultimately in this situation where typically there's a process around onboarding suppliers, and you get to know the supplier really well before you onboard them, and depending on the criticality, that process could be expedited or it could take a while. But I think to the point that we're talking about around tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, and the potential risk that you as the at the top of the supply chain have, it's going to become imperative, especially as you're trying to meet many of these goals around ESG, for example. We talked about modern slavery, that there's a level of diligence that's happening on these tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. And it can't be to the point that Malcolm made. It can't be audits. It can't be labor-intensive, responses. But what it needs to be is some level of being able to identify and ingest and understand different data sources and be able to try to establish that. So we're seeing a lot of our customers asking us to do initial and ongoing checks on tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. On the flip side to that, we're seeing also supply chains to the point that Will was making around diversity are looking to identify diverse suppliers and leverage their tier 1 suppliers to help them with that process. So ultimately, we're seeing top companies say, hey, we need to make sure we're directing spend in our tier 1 to diverse suppliers across a wide range of services, and that's critical. And then can they rely on their suppliers to take that next level of supplier and really mentor them, identify them, and bring them up as well? So from the bottom up, the supply chain is becoming more diverse, more scalable, and more valuable at all parts of it. So I think there'll be a big focus on that. I think I think leading companies are willing to invest a lot of that cash that they're sitting on to do this, because they do see the value to stakeholders, to shareholders, to future employees, investors, everywhere in between. So I think more to come on that as we go along.
That's great. And Ingrid, perhaps you could talk a little bit about how your company is changing or speeding up its goals for greater sustainability.
Yeah, I love it. The first thing I'd like to say is we talked about sustainability and a focus of sustainability to address ESG type of expectations, demands from investors, a source of talent. Those are all true. But I'll say what makes it different, especially for ABE, is it's not some side project. It's not some nice to have for us. It's an absolute must. And I'll romanticize it a little bit here, but just picture that that beer that you want to drink, that cold beer that you want to drink. It's made from natural ingredients, right? It's made from water, and that's the biggest chunk of the ingredients, and all natural ingredients. So we have a responsibility to protect the environments in which we grow those ingredients, as well as the communities from which we source them. Knowing that it's our duty and primary responsibility to take care of that environment so that we as an organization can continue to last for the next 100 years. So that's kind of the reason why we invest so much of our time and resources into sustainability. We have our 2025 goals that are out there for almost 3 years now, and we've been really progressing very well on the majority of those goals, especially I would say on carbon reduction. Scope 1, of course, within our control is the easiest to address, and then going to Scope 2 and 3 is a little bit more challenging, but we're very well on track to deliver our goals. So we're starting to think of, okay, what's next, right? What are those next boundaries? And that conversation really is ongoing internal, which I really appreciate. I do want to come back to that collaboration that Malcolm raised. Not a single company can do it by themselves, right? And I think every one of us can recognize that. So it's about that partnership, that collaboration that we all need to drive. So that's where I would just want to talk about a platform that we launched, Eclipse. Let me talk to you about procurement at AB, right? We would never have thought of bringing suppliers that compete with each other together in one room and discuss about business and how can we make it more sustainable. Imagine that, right? Just imagine that they would talk about price setting in a setting like that. We would never even think about that. So 2 years ago, we did bring them all together in the same room when it was still allowed. And now we do that virtually to work together on those shared goals, to establish some of those benchmarks and clearly show how some of our supply chain partners reach them, and then share the best practice on how to do that, right? So an example there would be someone who helped us set up our virtual power purchase agreement, share that with the rest of our supply chain, because we have nothing to win by just holding that to ourselves. We can actually share the love and the intelligence here so that everyone can work to decarbonize their supply chain. And I would say it's not only because it's a must, and I would put in a plug of this actually fuels a lot of innovation that we would even have thought about, to bring that collaboration with all of your supply chain partners, raises discussions that all of a sudden generates a huge innovation out there. So we just launched our Michelob Ultra low carbon can, and that is because of the collaboration with tier 1, 2, and 3 suppliers in the Eclipse platform, that we talk about how can we make this happen. So it's an important source of innovation for the organization that then can be carried by a brand.
That's a superb example, Ingrid. Thank you. And Thomas, we talked the other day about the importance of SMEs, that they are going to be key to the recovery of the global economy. But is there a sense, do you think, that they are doing enough in the supply chain with regards to driving sustainability, or is there a sense of window dressing?
I don't think it's, let's say, intentional window dressing. I think there's a gap, maybe a gap in terms of knowledge, maybe a gap in terms of true end-to-end leadership to get the small, medium-sized enterprises engaged. But again, if you look at the facts, a lot of the mature practices are in the companies that are customer-facing, that are close to the larger multinationals. The further away from that you become, the less mature. And I think here there's often been a bit of a statement from small, medium-sized enterprises that you're so well resourced and we don't have the knowledge, and we shouldn't really be that engaged. And that's where my opinion is that's just fundamentally flawed. The world economy is sitting on the back of our small, medium-sized enterprises. I don't know how many percent, but probably 80% of the world economy sits in these type of organizations. And that makes it really important that they do get engaged. There's a lot of regulatory activities happening in different countries, recently in Germany, but you have the French, the Swiss, Brits are all in here. And of course, also, I think those are mechanisms that also help invite the small, medium-sized enterprises to be part of the solution. And again, there are communities that can also engage with them, because what I think one of the fears is it's expensive, it's time consuming, and we don't have the infrastructure, which I think nowadays with technology, with what is available, it is good business to eliminate waste. It's good business to shift from fossil to renewables. It's just about how do you go about it? How do you use sustainability as a source of innovation? And we need to invite them, and not to to talk too much, but I think that the regulators have a very important role to play. They have an important role, of course, in putting out some minimum requirements, but they also have a responsibility of not complicating life for all of us. So it's important we have it at a high level, OECD, UN, whatever. But it's also important that there is a bit of both carrot and stick. A lot of the current philosophy is quite punitive. It's like you must do or else bad things will happen. And less so, here's a good idea. If we can invite you to have the right behavior, you pull them along. And I think regulators are important, and they have a big role in balancing a bit, of course, stick, but certainly also to put the carrot out there.
Regulators certainly have a tough balance to strike, although because of the rapid transformations supply chain functions have been forced to go through since March 2020, I tend to agree that more carrot and less stick would be advisable at the moment as businesses are recalibrating. Anyway, that's a positive note on which to conclude this virtual roundtable session. There are 2 other videos in this series sponsored by Refinitiv, a London Stock Exchange Group business. One that considers what, aside from ESG pressures, are the other factors to consider when creating a resilient supply chain. And the other one asks, how will the procurement and supply chain functions evolve in the coming years? Please do check those out. and click on the links to hear what our experts have to say about those two topics. Thank you very much for watching.